calling, yeah, from University College of Minnesota, College of Design of University of Minnesota, and he has a very large experience previously with design, with biomimicry especially, and he has worked in companies like Google, and has been head of Biomimicry Center, Innovation Space. So now he will briefly talk to you about what is design, how to go beyond anthropocentric design and mimicry. So Prasad, welcome.
Great. Thank you, Victor, for the introduction. Thank you, Zuhara, for inviting me to speak at this seminar. And Eric, thank you as well for helping with the setup. So I have a presentation, which I will start. Great. Can everyone see my screen? Are we okay? Wonderful. All right, great. Yeah, so as Victor mentioned, I have background in industrial design, but also in anthropology and biological inspired design as well. So most of my work sort of exists in the space where we try and bring design close to other disciplines from where we can learn and improve our design methods and practices. So today I thought I'd speak quickly about this notion of going beyond anthropocentric design. And if you look at design methods and practices, the sort of prevalent or prevailing methodology for doing design is often referred to as human-centered design or user-centered design, people-centered design. We have several words for it. And there's quite a bit of methodology that's been developed around this topic of HCD, including guidebooks, toolkits, etc. This is a toolkit that's developed by the design consultancy IDEO based in Palo Alto, California. And this notion of designing for people goes back quite a ways. So this is just an initial page from a book called Designing for People by a gentleman called Henry Dreyfuss from the US. He wrote this book in 1953. And in this book, he talked about how the things we design are used by people. And he also is considered to be the father of human factors and ergonomics. So he Dreyfuss wrote this book called The Measure of Man and Woman, in which he introduced the notion of anthropomorphy in looking at anthropometric design. He introduced two characters, Joe and Josephine, and introduced this notion of how do we design for the human body from 5th percentile to 95th percentile. And so the notion of designing around people has been with us for a while. And it's better than purely technologically driven design, which I spent a few years in industry in Silicon Valley and very frequently see companies who introduce new products to the market simply because they have the means, the technological means of doing so. And very often no user research is done, no prior questions are asked about, does this even make sense? Will people buy it? Does it improve people's lives? And so there's this whole notion of technologically driven products. So human-centered design is better than purely technologically driven projects, and even better than purely market-driven design, where things are made simply because they can be sold. And so human-centered design goes beyond these other two methods of doing design work and putting products into the market. And the fundamental concept that drives human-centered design is the notion of needs, human needs. And so people do ethnographic research. Designers go out into the field, into the wild, as they say, and try and understand the needs of people, observe the context in which these needs exist, and then start coming up with ideas that meet the specific needs of those people. So it's, in a way, human-centered design starts with the notion of need, so we can also refer to it as need-centered design. But I've always wondered if as designers, we have taken this notion of need-centered design to an extreme. And we'll take an example. So this is the very simple, humble Swiss Army knife, which over time has gathered more features, like you can see in this case. It in some cases gets even beyond. It adds more sort of technological features. And there's this product which exists as well, which it is incredibly bizarre, which no longer looks like a Swiss knife. I'm not sure whose pocket this will fit in anymore. And so in a sense, we've sort of taken this notion of needs a bit beyond understanding. Let's take another example. So if you go to, in the US, where I am, if you go to stores like Williams-Sonoma, Pottery Barn, these are kitchen stores. And you can go into one of these stores and you can buy a tool that could help you mash avocados or peel and slice an apple or core an apple, or you can get something that can remove the seeds of a strawberry. You can buy something that slices strawberries or slices bananas, cores jalapeno peppers, removes the husks from a corn, pits cherries, slices a mango, slices a peach, or you can use this, right? So one wonders, do we need so many specifically designed devices where this one simple tool, which has been around for centuries, could do the job? And so I think people have taken this notion of need-centered design, the problem of designing for people, a bit to an extreme, and we sort of forget the problems that exist because we live on one planet and we face a series of other problems of resources and waste that we need to pay attention to beyond human needs. And why I wonder, why have we not paid attention to this, or why are we continue to doing design that is sort of so driven by this notion of human need? And the reasons for that are plenty: economic, educational, cultural, individual, historical, institutional. We simply have been so wedded to one way of doing design that we forget the larger context of the planet on which we live. And so we need to start thinking, in my opinion, beyond human-centered design. And we need to start thinking of the idea that we share this planet with a lot more than just people, and we can start to reimagine not only our relationship to nature, but also redesigning design itself. So how do we do this? How do we reimagine our relationship to nature? And we should recognize, of course, that we are part of nature. We are one of the many species that exist on this planet. We shouldn't separate ourselves from nature, but we often do. And one way to start reimagining that is to think of the awe that we see when we are in nature. If you see children in nature exploring, picking up insects, looking around, they have this sense of awe about nature, and we can sort of rebuild that awe of nature. And how have we, at least in the US, imagined living on this planet? If you look at this photograph, this is a photograph from the deserts of Arizona. And it's an aerial photograph that very, very clearly shows how we live on this planet. So on the right, you see the desert. This is part of what's called the Sonoran Desert in the state of Arizona. And on the left, you see development, you see housing, you see building. We build walls and we transform the environment to make it suitable for us. And in that process, we sort of, in a sense, don't really understand how nature works or how to live in this planet. And so this is another photograph from Arizona. This is from a town called Bisbee in southwestern Arizona, where there's a history of copper mining, copper gold mining. And if you might be familiar with open pit mining. Open pit mining uses tons of extremely harsh chemicals. It destroys the landscape. As you can see, not a single piece of vegetation or living being could survive in this sort of space. We look at that liquid down there, I can't even imagine the levels of toxicity in that stuff that's down there. So our relationship to nature, and this has been the case for quite a while, is to extract from it what we need without thinking of the impact of what that extraction means. So Victor mentioned biomimicry in the introduction. So when people who think of biomimicry think of nature, they think of what we can learn from it rather than what we can extract from it. So this is a quote from Janine Benyus, who is probably one of the best known writers and thought leaders of biomimicry or learning from nature. She says we should mine nature for ideas and not for minerals. Another photograph from Arizona. This is again the Sonoran Desert, and we have these cacti, the saguaro cacti, that have been living in this climate for a very, very long time. And so you can see the difference in how these organisms live in the desert and how we as organisms live in the desert. You saw that earlier photograph of housing versus the desert. I also lived many years in California, where we have these redwood trees. And these redwood trees are the tallest trees on the planet. They are able to move nutrients from the soil up to hundreds of feet into the air. And they do that without loud, noisy, massively energy-consuming pumps. So what Janine says in her book, Biomimicry, Innovation Inspired by Nature, that came out in the 90s, that we can start to emulate nature's genius. We can start to examine how organisms that live on the planet have adapted to the conditions in which they live, how ecosystems, all the organisms inside an ecosystem rely on each other's presence and make things work for themselves. And so her definition of biomimicry is the conscious emulation of nature's genius. And there are plenty of examples, right? Probably the most common example of biomimicry that's often cited is the one that comes from this burdock seed, which the seed attaches itself to any hairy animal going by, like cattle, goats, etc. And that inspired the Swiss scientists to look at the mechanism by which the seed attaches itself to these creatures, so it can disperse itself out into the wild, which is referred to as the hook and loop system of attachment, aka Velcro. However, if we continue to make Velcro with polymers, petroleum-based polymers, we are not truly mimicking how nature works. So if you think of the seed, the burdock seed that attaches itself to a goat, the goat travels, the seed falls off, another creature maybe walks on it, it breaks open, the seed gets embedded in the soil, and it actually gives life to something new. Petrochemical-based plastics do not do that. So what ends up happening is these things end up in the landfill and they sit there for a very long time. They do not degrade well, if at all. And when we start thinking of mimicking nature to the very end, if we start making this material in a way that doesn't harm the environment, disappears benignly in the environment, then we have done true biomimicry. So I think the emphasis on biomimicry should be not just to copy nature, but to copy nature in order to create sustainable solutions. I think that should be the drive. So in addition to reimagining our relationship to nature, we can also redesign design itself. And that's why I think anthropocentric design or human-centered design falls short. If you think of the species on this planet, we are only one, represented here by the amazing Charles Darwin, of millions of species. We actually do not even know how many species exist on this planet. There are some estimates, but those estimates are wild, and we simply have no clue. Very few of the species actually mapped and known, but we know that there's a lot that we yet do not know. And so if you think about all the species on the planet, our relationship to nature, our relationship to other species on the planet is more like this, that we are the apex predator, we are on the top, and we therefore can eat, control, destroy all that is below us. It might be better for us to reimagine that relationship and think of us in a network of connected species that are not necessarily, yes, there are hierarchies in nature. Yes, there are apex predators, but it's the network system, the way ecosystems work. Whenever one species gets too dominant, it sort of creates an imbalance in the ecosystem. And so what we should aim for is not this sort of a hierarchy where we are the apex predator, but one in which we have a much more networked and a nuanced relationship to other species on the planet. And so as Janine Benyus says, we need to learn from nature, and you start learning about nature. At least for me, you learn the most remarkable things that build this sense of awe. There's this really remarkable book, a series of remarkable books by two myrmecologists, Edward O. Wilson, who some of you might be familiar with, who died just a few years ago from Harvard, and Bert Holdobler, who spent their entire careers learning about ants and ant colonies. And they have said that if you destroy all the insects on the planet, humans will vanish. And they've also said that if you weigh all the ants on the planet, they might be more than or equal to the weight of all the humans on the planet. So also these sorts of, you learn these amazing things in addition to a whole host of other things about ants that really give you pause and make you start to understand, respect, and learn from the species that live around us. There are so many examples. The example of this dung beetle, right? This dung beetle is a creature that, imagine you're in sub-Saharan Africa, a herd of elephants go by, they drop tons of dung. Out of nowhere, these dung beetles arrive, they roll up all this dung that's essentially waste into these balls, these beautifully spherical balls. They very often the female sits on top of the ball, the male rolls it, they take it into their nest. The female lays her eggs into this ball. So when the little dung beetle babies are born, they have all this delicious food right around them. And so in a sense, they're converting the waste into a resource. And that's of this interconnected ecosystem that we could be thinking about. So the Biomimicry Center and the Biomimicry 3.8 group have come up with a series of what they refer to as life's principles. And they're all biologists, they studied several organisms and looked at how do organisms live on this planet. And they came up with all these strategies. There's a lot of depth to this. So if you just look up life's principles, you'll see this. So if you look at just the circle and the text in green, organisms adapt to changing conditions. They are locally attuned and responsive. They use life-friendly chemistry. They are resource efficient. They integrate development with growth. They evolve to survive. And in the center, you see this phrase that says, life creates conditions conducive to life. So life leads to more life. And we can start thinking of these principles in our design work as well. So how can we do that? For example, you can look at specific things like use multifunctional design, fit form to function, recycle our materials. These are known strategies, but you find these in nature all the time. If you look at, again, back to the Sonoran Desert and the landscape and the cacti, you can see that if you think back to that photograph I showed, the aerial view of the Sonoran Desert, all the houses were identical, right? These are often referred to as cookie cutter homes. They are built on the same plan, the same structure, the same design, and they're replicated over and over. Compare that with this. We have hundreds of cacti in this one or a few in this photograph. Not one cactus is similar to the other one. They're all different. They're in different stages of growth. They also, because they're on a slope, they get different amounts of water. They have different soil. They get different amounts of light. And so they're adapted to those different conditions. In some cases, they may have more arms if they are older, if they're more, the land is such that they have more water, they have more resources, they'll grow taller, bigger. So depending upon the kind of resources they have, the kind of conditions in which they exist, they'll grow accordingly. And that's something really interesting to observe and learn from nature. What we do, similar to the example of the cookie cutter homes, is we standardize and we build in large quantities, we mass produce, and each object is exactly identical because we use the economy of scale to make that happen. It's easier, cheaper, faster, more efficient for us to build in this way. But in the end, it doesn't really work that well, because this notion of one size fits all is quite a fallacy. It actually, in my mind, what it really means is it doesn't fit anyone really well. And so we have to kind of start thinking beyond this sort of paradox or paradigm of one size fits all. So we need to think of how do we go from standardized to customized, rigid to more adaptive, obsolete to upgradable, disposable to repairable. And these are the kinds of ideas that we can learn from nature to move our designs forward as well. So what we've been thinking about and trying to do at the universities where I worked and also at Google was this notion of beyond anthropocentric design and thinking not human-centered, but life-centered. So how can we design keeping in mind not just one species, the human species, but all species on the planet? Can we expand the scope of human-centered design? So I'm not saying that human-centered design should be tossed out and it's not good, but it's limiting, it's myopic, and we need to think more beyond one species, think of all species on the planet and think more of life-centered design. And what's interesting to think about these organisms and these creatures is we talked of the example of the Velcro. So the Velcro, when it dies, or in other words, when it's lived its life and it stopped being useful to people, it just sits in the landfill. Nothing really happens. It does not degrade. It is not useful to anything else. It actually creates problems in the environment. In contrast, if you think of the saguaro, so the saguaro live, they are born, they live, and they die. And when the saguaro die, they come crashing down. Because these saguaro cacti are so good at conserving water, they're extremely heavy, they absorb enormous amounts of water. In fact, there are studies that have shown that the saguaro cactus is very interesting in terms of its structure. It has one big sort of taproot-like thing that goes down into the soil. It gives it stability and structure. But it also has tons of smaller roots that are just beneath the surface of the soil. And when it starts raining, they actually very quickly are able to absorb water and also start growing newer roots to absorb even more water. So they are storehouses of water. And when these come crashing down, that water starts slowly leaking and oozing out from those saguaro cacti. So you will see actually rivulets, streams coming out of the saguaro for days, weeks sometimes from the cactus. And that leads to more life. In fact, I've seen little creatures, little insects drinking from the little rivulets from the saguaro because it's always so dry and hot in the desert. So this cactus, as it comes crashing down, as it ends its life, it gives life to others. And so it's a really interesting way to think about how we think of the things that we design. Can we reimagine the way we design? Can we reimagine the presence of our products on the planet that mimic what these organisms do and not just sit there and rot and cause more problems in the environment? Well, thank you very much. I'll stop here. I essentially just wanted to make a quick presentation. I was told it shouldn't go too long and leave a little time for Q&A if we have any. But thank you again for inviting me to speak. And I look forward to a discussion if we have time.
So does anybody have a question? Perhaps, yeah, you can just, okay, clap, applause. Yeah, I agree. This was actually a very interesting lecture. Is there any questions? Otherwise, I can ask. Oh, there, Catherine.
Oh, yes. Thanks so much, Prasad, for a great presentation. Really inspiring ideas here. I was, my area of study is ergonomics and human factors. So user-centered design and people-centered design has been really, really central to a lot of the frameworks that we think of here. I am really interested in some of the ideas that you present about people as one part within nature and framing design more around that type of worldview or that type of ethos. And I'm wondering, or I didn't catch it in your presentation, but I'm wondering if you have found kinship with this worldview, or perhaps similar ideas in indigenous teachings, thinking in Minnesota, where I understand Wapikute or Sakoan people, and Arizona, maybe Pima and Hohokam people, if given that the idea of relationality between nature and a sense of equality between different aspects of nature. So I myself grew up in Canada, so I'm more familiar with the Cree ideas of animism and thinking of plants and animals as all of my relations as a way of sort of thinking about this. So perhaps some of these ideas, although they're new for me to think about in an academic context, it seems like some of them might actually have been with people or with certain cultures, certain people for a long time. So I'm curious, I'm curious if you have made any connections or thoughts on that.
Yes, definitely. So the relationship of humans to nature has of course a long history. And you're right, the tribes here, in Minnesota, I just moved here a couple of months ago, so I'm still not quite familiar. But the two large tribes in this region, the Ojibwe and the Dakota, have of course have the Native Americans in general have had a long sort of relationship to the lands on which they live. Very often in very many cultures, the nature and specific aspects of nature are thought of as gods. They're revered, and the humans have kind of a unique relationship to the gods of nature. So yes, this notion of learning from nature goes back quite a ways. This idea of respecting nature is also something that goes back quite a ways. And yes, I think indigenous peoples do have a relationship to nature that is not purely one of extracting from it. However, we also have known from, so the big tribes in Arizona are the Navajo and Hopi tribes. And there have been some, when farming started, we all know that when we do farming, if it's at a very small scale, it's okay. But when you have sort of monocultures or you have larger farms, it does leave some sort of environmental damage behind. There have been situations where some, not large farms, not industrial sized farms like you see in the world today, but there have been situations where certain farms have been found where it was not entirely, so we also have to be careful of not to romanticize the relationship between indigenous peoples and the land on which they lived. But definitely, they had a lot more close ties to the land on which they lived. They often extracted only what they needed and not anymore. In our practices of large-scale manufacturing, industrialization, economies of scale, I think we have completely forgotten that sense of balance. And that sense of balance that existed with indigenous communities is not there anymore. And that's why I think we are in the situation in which we live. So when things scale up, I think we just mess it up. And when things happen at a smaller scale, as we did with these local tribes and smaller communities, it was a lot more possible to handle it. But I think we've just kind of blown that out of proportion, and hence the massive problems.
Thanks for that. I appreciate especially your comments about not romanticizing or putting undue expectations on
Yes.
on indigenous people in particular. Certainly the traditional worldviews also exist now within a context of capitalism and kind of a general, like a broader culture. And but thanks for that.
You're welcome.
Thank you. I think there was another question. Could the person please raise their hand again? Yes, Soledad, I think you can ask.
Yeah, hi. Thank you for this great presentation. I think it was very interesting. And I just would like to ask you about like the diagrams. I think it was interesting to see like the man over the whole system, and then the woman, if it's the woman on the side. So it's interesting if this has happened all the time. I see the diagram that just came out a couple of years ago. And the other thing is like, how do you think that we could target people on sustainable practices? And how are we going to shift people thinking when regarding caring about nature?
Yeah, so Rafael, what was your first, is it Soledad, is that your name?
Yeah.
What was your first question about the diagram? I didn't understand the question. I couldn't hear it quite well.
The question about the diagram, is it like if this diagram always has become or has been like that, like the man on the top is like as you said, like is the man on the top all the time. And I just see that the women or the woman is on the side. So I think it's interesting to see like how, I mean, even in nature, or if analyzing this, it's a kind of interesting thing.
Yeah, I mean, so we all know that we live in a very, very patriarchal society. We all know that in the work environments, home environments, for not all societies, not all cultures, but male dominance, patriarchy, suppression of women is something that has been happening for centuries. We know that. And so that diagram, in a way, is not only a reflection of our relationship with nature, but also the relationship between our genders as well. So it's the diagram I found online when I was kind of looking about this, and it's been used in other sort of biomimicry presentations as well. And your second question, Soledad, was about how do we go about changing the way people think about this? And I think because I'm at a university and I've been so partly in industry and partly in universities, to me, the path to doing this is first and foremost education. We have to start training students to think about design in much broader ways. The thing that we were doing at Arizona State University, and I'm hoping I can do this here as well at the University of Minnesota, is not only training designers, but training a whole range of disciplines to think differently about how we make stuff. For example, I was teaching a class and running a program called Innovation Space, where we had students from 5 different disciplines and schools working together in teams and on projects, from industrial design, graphic design, business, engineering, and our School of Sustainability. These are all undergraduate students. They were in their 4th year. They had a year-long project. And so we worked with corporations. We got some funding from corporations. We focused on projects that were of social value, but also will be environmentally sustainable. So we worked on projects like designing for people with disabilities, designing for healthcare, designing for children with autism. So the projects were focused specifically on addressing social issues, but also we taught them the methodology of working in teams, learning from each other, and applying principles of sustainability. So everything from following this sort of process of learning from nature, there's a very specific methodology that we follow that goes beyond just the standard methodology of go out and do user research, come back, start designing the product, etc. But actually look at nature, come with a list of functions, try to find out how this happens in nature. We also work very closely with biologists, because in order to do biomimicry well, you have to really understand how biology works. And as designers, we can't really understand the depth of the biology. But working closely with biologists, they would help us understand how a certain organism functions, how a certain species is able to adapt to that condition. How does the saguaro store water? How does the saguaro withstand this sort of heat? So we would learn from biologists. And so the students earlier on learned that this process of doing design learns from a variety of other disciplines, learns from nature. We also help them do life cycle assessment of the product. So can you look at all the impacts of the product over the life cycle? So as I talked about the life cycle of the saguaro, what's the life cycle of the product, from raw materials to transportation to lifetime use to energy consumption during end of life? So we looked at all those aspects and taught students about this. So I think education is probably one of the biggest mechanisms by which to do this. I also think regulation. We need a lot more regulation. The EU is a lot better at this than the US in terms of having regulations around packaging, having regulations around energy consumption, having regulation around disposal and producer responsibility. The EU is so much farther ahead than the US. So I think regulations and education might be 2 really strong strategies by which we can start to change mindsets of how this happens.
Thank you very much. Very, very.
Oh, thank you very much. Does anyone else have a question? Could everyone who has a question raise their hand? I see one person. And that's it. Oh, 2 people. Okay. Well, Catherine, you wrote on the chat, and I think we'll find a way to answer your question to not lose time. But the other person, what is your Masood?
Hello, thank you. Yes, that's my name. Thank you for great presentation and for being with us in such time in the US.
You're welcome, Masood.
Yeah, thank you. My question was that I kind of, when you sent now I can't really say the word, but when we had this human-centered design, So first of all, I come from a design for disabilities and cognitive disabilities, and with the anthropocentric design, we always had that kind of a, we were marginalized in design science. I wonder, with the view towards nature, if there is a space for the marginalized, like disabled. And from what I study the cognitive disability, so I wonder if there is some space, some kind of a way forward for us in that sense, in that perspective.
Yeah, so we did quite a few projects at Arizona State University in this program that I just mentioned called Innovation Space around design for people with disabilities. We often focused on visual disabilities and mobility challenges. For instance, we had, so we use a human-centered design methodology quite a bit, but on top of that, we sort of added this layer of learning from nature. So the way we did this was to, so if you're designing a product, regardless of what product it is and what space it is for, whether it's for people with disabilities or it's some kind of other device, the way we did this was, the first thing you do is you make a list of all the functions. So my product needs to do a series of things, which could include things like it needs to fold frequently. It needs to be able to easy to wash, easy to clean. It needs to have a certain color. It needs to change color. So we make a very, very long list of the kind of functions that the product has to, and I'm talking about physical products in this case, the kind of functions that the product has to be able to address. And then we try to find corollaries in nature. So is there anything in nature that is able to fold and unfold quickly, like leaves, for example? And so we went from there to find out, okay, so if leaves do it, how are leaves doing it without complicated hinging mechanisms that get dirty and don't open anymore? How does nature do that? And so from those list of functions, we came up with sort of solutions from nature. But we didn't specifically look at, is there this idea of disability in nature and how is that dealt with? We have to be a little careful with that because, for example, we can't mimic everything in nature. We have to be careful of what we mimic. For instance, there are certain ant colonies that, ant colonies are massive. They get infected sometimes with fungus. And in some cases, the ants, what they do is they will initially take care of the sick ants. But if they discover that these sick ants are affecting the other ants, the healthy ants or the little babies or the larvae, they will throw those ants out of the nest. So we can't use that for nursing in our case. So we have to be careful with what we mimic from nature. And the way we dealt with it was to think of it more at a functional level. What does the product need to do, rather than what is the broader framework in which this product exists, and then sort of try to find corollaries in nature from where we could learn.
Okay, thank you very much. I think there's no more questions. I will maybe ask my question. Well, you talked about diversifying the design to center it more on the needs of each person, and of course by basing it on nature. But don't you think that this could consume actually more resources and create more pollution and harm to nature, rather than creating something united for everyone? And also in relation to this, maybe you could name like a successful example of implementing this biomimicry concept in industry.
What was your first question, Victor? I didn't quite understand.
My first question was, don't you think that by individualizing, like by making more small scale, individualizing each product for each person, and not making, as you showed, all the cars identical, don't you think that this actually consumes more resources and more pollution to create something individual for everyone?
Yeah, good question. So we have been so used to this way of building, of economies of scale, where if you produce the same thing over and over again, it is an economical way of doing it. We standardize our processes in order to do so, but we have to rethink how we do that. So in the current paradigm, yes, if we start with making customization of every vehicle, of every house, it could use more resources. But if we start rethinking that paradigm, then I think we can minimize this problem. And there already is flexible manufacturing, this notion of mass customization, of modularity, those things by which we can actually try and not consume more resources. So I think it's possible to do it, but we have to rethink the way we do production, the way we do manufacturing. So that was the first question. Your second question was examples. There are tons of examples of conceptual products, of products that are in the market. If you just go to the Biomimicry Center website, or if you look up Biomimicry 3.8, which is Janine's organization, they have a list of products that have employed very well the principles of nature. Also, there's a website called Ask Nature, asknature.org. So, for example, if you are trying to design something and if you have a function in mind, like I need something that is easy to clean, you can go to Ask Nature, and there's a search engine. You can ask a question and say, how does cleaning happen in nature? And it'll give you a series of examples, like the lotus leaf, for example, which has these nano hairs and water just rolls off and it takes dust away with it. And there's this company that's created a paint that you can put on the outside of buildings that automatically, as water falls, and it washes off the dust. So you will find strategies of nature, but you also will find examples of products that are derived from that. So Biomimicry 3.8 is a good website to go take a look at. And also asknature.org. I think you'll find tons of examples of this work. Or just doing a quick Google search of biomimicry examples, you'll find quite a few.
Okay, thank you. I think that actually partly answers Catherine's question that she wrote. Are there resources we can where we can learn more? I guess, yeah, this is answered. We would just like to tell you that your feedback is important for us. So those who listen to the seminar, you're invited to press on the link that's posted by my colleague Zuhara in the chat, and it's a short survey. Otherwise, are there any more questions before we finish? I think that's it then. So yeah, for me, I also don't have any more questions, and it was actually a very interesting field to think about for the future. Something we could really definitely consider in our mindset.
Well, thank you for inviting me to speak. It was a pleasure. And yeah, good luck to you all.
Thank you very much for the presentation. Good
Thank
night.
you. Thank you. You're welcome.